Hello, my lovelies. I'm Ginny O, the author with no last name, and today I want to talk about writing approachable books in adult science fiction and fantasy. I mentioned in a previous video I don't write high literature even for science fiction or fantasy. I don't even bother to try. And I do write my books for adults, mostly, older teens could read them too. So in this video, I am talking about the adult section of the bookstore and not the children's or the young adult section. So I personally write Anne Bishop family style dynamics meeting Jim Butcher type action stuff in one set of books, and my other set of published novels are mixed up fairy tales. So I want to write approachable stories. I want to write for a broader target audience, people who may have not read science fiction or fantasy before and are trying to get into something new because they just like something about my concepts or something. So I've been trying to dig back into more recently published science fiction and fantasy. In the adult science fiction and fantasy I'm having a very hard time finding anything that's approachable. Things that I could recommend to someone who is new to the genre and wants something recent and in the adult section, especially if they are a younger reader or want something in today's writing style rather than like the style of the 70s or the 80s. Science fiction is always tough. In my opinion, there are too many authors trying to shoehorn hard science ideas into their stories and throwing a science into the story in order to make it more technical or valid or real. Science fiction often gets in the way of the actual story conflicts and plot, or it outs the author or the main character is completely out of their league. For fantasy, change out science and put in world building, economics, or language. And this turns off readers. They don't finish the books. For instance, if I talked about sociology or anthropology or so on in my biker werewolf books to make them more hard science, I turn off the readers I want because they want, I hope, cute stories about biker werewolves who are really big families getting into squabbles and doing security jobs. Or doing security jobs and having squabbles. Of course, this could lead into the arguments of sociology, psychology, and anthropology are actually hard science or not. Let's not go there. And so stories about werewolves having family squabbles can address family dynamics without me sitting there talking about good or bad family dynamics or what is and isn't abuse or how societies function anthropologically. This isn't Bones. And even on Bones, they kept it to a few episodes and mostly for comedy. And I don't have characters in there with those types of degrees as main characters to talk about it on purpose. And I'm worried that there's this fear in authors for books for adults who are trying to get traditional publishing contracts. If they don't include a hard science for science fiction or a lot of world building for fantasy or blatantly try to address some issues, they won't be taken seriously as an adult author and will be shelved in the young adult section. Or they think they have to make their books long after they do their debut because everyone is writing long books with lots of tangled storylines these days. I know I've done a video about why I don't like too long books, and yes, a lot of the more technical, harder science fiction and fantasy books tend to be longer. This doesn't honestly have to be the case. I just don't necessarily feel that there is a correlation here between length and lack of approachability when it comes to styles of writing. Length and, maybe there's too much world building and not enough plot, yes, but not on style of writing. There is a place for fantasy and science fiction that tackles big issues with lots of technical words written by people with fancy degrees. There is a place for the Sandersons, the R.F. Kings, and Asimovs of this world, and those books appeal to a very small group of people. If you had a book like Babel to somebody who is outside of that group of people, they are either not going to finish it or be offended by it because the themes outweigh the story rather than supporting the story. Because there is a certain amount of intellectual snobbery in this world, or the perception of it by certain social groups. So the things that are popular that gain traction are properties like Marvel, or Star Trek, or Star Wars, or Harry Potter. These properties have good messages, despite their creators sometimes, and resonate with a lot of people, but they don't do so in a preachy $5 vocabulary, pages and pages of info dumping and fake history, pseudo debate between characters type of way. They weren't created to appease academia. They were created for the masses, or for children in some cases. Things they decry now for being woke, and yet when they were children, they didn't even think of race or sexuality of the characters on their screen or in their books. Most people do not want to hack through Sanderson or Rothfuss or Bova right off the bat. They need something that is going to A, interest them, and B, isn't going to intimidate them in length or writing style or the way the things are presented in the book. Most people come to reading a book when they're sick, tired, or the cat has laid down in their lap and won't let them move. They don't have the mental energy to wade through highly constructed technical prose. And many adults don't want to go to the young adult section to try to find a book to read. They don't want to do it. There's a stigma there. Okay. They want a story. They want it to feel somewhat familiar, either a setting that's almost like their own or a bunch of tropes they like. They don't want it to be a huge length, which I readily admit I fail at, but it's less obvious in a digital medium than a paper one. They want to escape their world. If you're going to try to approach a theme or shine a spotlight on something, they don't want to be told it in the narrative, they want to be shown. Showing things takes words. Why I fail the whole length thing. Showing takes a lot of work too, especially if you're trying to attack things like colonialism or racism. You have to come up with situations where the characters face these things, instead of the characters pompously talking about them. I don't care how much they talk about them, it's always going to come off as pompous. It's like doing a telephone conversation between characters, or a diner conversation, and they're talking about other characters who aren't there in a form of gossip. No one cares. That's telling. Instead, we'd rather see the characters interact with the characters they're gossiping about. That's showing. Show feelings, tell emotions, show your theme. Don't tell me the theme in the narrative. No one likes to be talked down to, especially if it is their first foray into a genre. If you start someone off with the Silmarillion instead of the Hobbit, you only have yourself to blame when they go, I don't like this, I'm not reading this genre again. Hook them with something easier and simple to understand, and they'll take up the harder stuff themselves later. And before you go, The Hobbit was written for children. As a child, I would never have picked up The Hobbit myself. It was too thick. I would never have picked up Redwall. It was too thick. And to find the Redwall in Tolkien books when I was in school, you had to go to the adult section. There was no young adult back then for Redwall or The Hobbit to be put into. The way I was introduced to The Hobbit and Redwall was it was read to me by a teacher. Then I also got an audiobook version of The Hobbit done by the BBC. That way the length wasn't as big of a deal or scary, and being the precocious child, I read and bought every single Redwall book I could get my hands on, which I still own all of them today. Other ways you can be introduced to both of those properties now were movies. Redwall actually has a cartoon, and that's awesome. But these books, which are still adult-length books more than young adult or child-length books, they are still very approachable. I think many of Heinlein's works are approachable. Card was approachable with Ender's Games, and those are longer works, while Asimov could greatly vary. Douglas Adams is approachable. There's a lot of older stuff from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s that feels very approachable and easy to get into, which I'm not seeing in debut adult fantasy and science fiction today. At least not as much. If you are, as an author, you're writing science fiction or fantasy for adults, and you're worried as you're seeing all these books with a lot of technical words or attack angles about themes or linguistics or massive amounts of political world building, and you don't want to do that, or you don't know how to do that, fear not, there are readers out there who want and will love to see and read fantasy and science fiction that is at the level of Anne McCaffrey, or Mercedes Lackey, or Robert Aspirin. Things that don't involve a lot of heavy technical stuff and assumes you will figure out what the technology or magic does without lots of explanation. Rule of cool is in effect, I guess. It's okay to write that type of approachable, what might be considered soft or even campy style of fiction. Campy doesn't have to be an insult. There's a place for you too in publishing and in the writer world. Don't worry about making it all science and I have to know the grain economy of my fantasy world. Just sit and write a good story that can resonate with people. You can figure out what your theme is about later if necessary. Over time, over multiple books. Sometimes you might not know until you've written 3 or 4 series or somebody else mentions it. That's okay. There are readers out there that I promise who will be happy they don't have to flip through pages and pages of explanations and exposition to get to the plot. Yeah. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourselves, my lovelies. Bless, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.